Hi everyone. In our last lesson, we looked at DNA, particularly around the structure of DNA and how DNA, the material, coils into chromosomes to be condensed and held in our cells. But what we're really focusing on in this unit is how that DNA works and how that DNA determines our traits. So today we're going to look at alleles, which you've probably heard. We did cover it a bit in Year 10. So we're going to look at alleles and how they influence our phenotypes, which is just a fancy word, I guess, for traits. You're going to have a look at some of your own phenotypes for particular traits, and then we're going to look at this term called genome. So alleles, like I said, you might have heard of this before, refer to genes. So as we looked in the last lesson, chromosomes contain thousands of genes each, and then, in humans, there's 23 pairs of those chromosomes. So each of those chromosomes contains thousands and thousands of genes. If we look here at a homologous pair of chromosomes, so let's say this is chromosome number 1, both versions of it, one from your mother, one from your father, the position that a certain gene is at on a chromosome is called the locus. Okay, kind of sounds like location because that's where that word comes from. So this is the gene locus for a particular gene, and the plural of that is loci. So these are the two loci for a particular gene. Some genes have variant forms. What that means is you can have different versions of a particular gene, and that is what we call an allele. Okay, so a good example of this is for eye color. So, eye color being the gene. It's actually multiple genes, but that is a gene. Alleles are different versions of that you can have. So you could have brown eyes, you could have blue eyes, you could have green eyes, you could have hazel eyes. They are all different alleles for the same gene. Okay. When alleles are written down, they're represented by a letter. So, for example, we might say that we use the letter B to determine to write down a particular allele. And diploid organisms, so any organism that has two genetic parents, will have two alleles. Okay, so you have one from one parent, one from the other. Now they may be the same allele, but they may not be. Just some important terminology that you get correct. So a genotype is the combination of alleles, okay, and that is written as two different letters, okay, and we'll go through the capital and the lowercase in a second, but a combination of alleles is the genotype. A phenotype is the trait or the feature that results from that genotype. Okay, if this sounds a little bit confusing, you're going to get lots and lots of practice with this, so don't worry about it. But for example, a phenotype, so having brown eyes is a phenotype, or blue eyes is a phenotype. So probably the best way to think about it is the phenotype is generally what you can see, if it is an external trait. Obviously, certain things might be internal and you can't see them, but that's what you can see. The genotype is what determines the phenotype, but we can't see the genotype. We can't look at a person's DNA and know exactly which two alleles they have at a particular gene locus. Okay. Once you've written this down, just have a go at question 1. All right, so looking a bit more at alleles now. As we said, diploid organisms inherit one allele from each parent. Okay, so let's just say, for example, that this is the chromosome that came from the egg from my mother. This is the chromosome that came from the sperm from my father. I've got two alleles for a particular gene. Some alleles are what we call dominant. And that means that if an allele is dominant, the organism only needs one version of that allele to express that phenotype. Okay, let's look again. I'll just use the eye color example. Let's say that brown eyes is a dominant allele. Okay, if it is dominant, it would be written with a capital B. So let's say I got the brown-eyed allele from my mother. You can also have a recessive allele, which means that you would need to have both versions. You'd need to have two of that allele to have that trait. So if we go back to our example, let's say lowercase b is blue eyes. Okay? So in this example, I got brown-eyed allele from mum. I got the blue-eyed allele from my father. This person would have brown eyes because you only need one of that dominant allele to have that trait. If there were two of this little b, so a little b and a little b, the person would have blue eyes. Okay, so that's the difference between dominant and recessive if we are talking about single gene traits, which is what we're going to start with looking at. Some important terminology here. We use the term homozygous if it's basically two of the same allele. Okay, so let's say an allele was expressed by the letter A homozygous dominant genotype would be two capital A's. Now, because that person has at least one of the dominant allele, they will show that trait, whatever that trait is. And we'll look at some examples in a second. A person could obviously get one dominant allele from one parent and a recessive allele from the other parent. So they would have a big A and a little a. We call this heterozygous. Okay, hetero means different. So that is when they have two different alleles. Okay, in this example, once again, that person will show that trait because they have at least one copy of the dominant allele. And then finally, a person could get two recessive alleles, a recessive allele from each parent. It's still homozygous because it's two of the same, but this time it's homozygous recessive. And in this case, because there is no dominant allele, the person will not have the trait. They will not have whatever that dominant trait is because they don't have an allele for it. Okay, so just go in and have a go at question 2. Okay, this is a bit of a trial. Normally, obviously, if we would do this in class, then it would be a bit easier, but I think we will be able to have a go at doing this online. I've got 4 common traits here, and what I want you to do to start with, I want you to identify your genotype for each of these traits. Now, as I said, you can't see your genotype. You can only see your phenotype. So you need to start there, okay? If we just move down here for a second, I'll explain what they are. So first I want you to, you're going to need a mirror. I want you to see, do you have dimples? And even one dimple counts as having dimples, okay? So dimples are a dominant trait. So if you have dimples, you are positive for that phenotype. You have it. If you do not have dimples, you obviously do not have that phenotype. If you don't have it, it's quite easy to figure out your genotype because you would have to be recessive, homozygous recessive, because you don't have that trait, okay? If you do have dimples, this is where it gets a bit tricky. If you have dimples, you could either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, okay? You can't tell which one you are just by looking at the fact you have dimples because you'd still have dimples regardless of which of these it is. So if for any of these you have the trait, I want you, if you can, and it's not distracting them, go see your parents, both of your parents if they're around, one parent, or you can just guess. But see, do they have the trait? Because if one of your parents does not, let's say you have dimples, your mum has dimples, but your dad does not have dimples. That means your dad has to be recessive, which means he could only have given you a recessive allele, which would mean that you are heterozygous, okay? Again, this is not 100% perfect, but if both of your parents have that trait and you have that trait, I want you to assume that you're homozygous dominant, okay? But basically for each trait, and I want you to write these on a piece of paper as well, because you will need it again in the next bit. Write down, you know, dimples. Yep, I've got dimples. Both my parents have dimples, so I'm going to say that I am homozygous dominant. Tongue rolling, so can you roll your tongue out? No, can't roll my tongue out, so I do not have that trait. I don't have the phenotype, and my genotype is homozygous recessive, and then the same for these next two. Just to explain what these are, so free earlobes are where there's a bit of a gap between the side of your head and your earlobe, so you can kind of jiggle around a little bit. Attached earlobes are when the bottom of your earlobe attaches kind of straight to the top of your neck. Okay, so if you have attached earlobes, you are two little e's. If you have earlobes that are a little bit wiggly, it would be dominant, so either dominant homozygous or heterozygous. And then a widow's peak is, do you have that kind of little triangle at your hairline? So people either have a really straight hairline or there's a little bit of a dip in there. Okay, so you'll need to pause this, write these down for each of them. You then need to put your answers into, or your phenotypes and genotypes into the quiz. And then once you've done that, and this is really, really important, this is where the class activity part comes into it. Once you've figured out yours, I want you to go into the Google Doc that I have shared in the Google Classroom post. Go into the Google Doc, and in there, I want you to add an X for each of your traits. Okay, so I've just done an example here. These are mine. So for dimples, tongue rolling, pre-earlobes, and widow's peak. You'll need to put 2 X's in each column. So you'll see this. So for dimples, for example, I do not have dimples. So I've put an X here because that phenotype is absent. I don't have it. And because I don't have it, I know that I am recessive because having dimples is dominant. Okay, and I don't have dimples, so I must have 2 recessive alleles. Tongue rolling, I can roll my tongue. So I've put an X here for that being present. Now, both of my parents can roll their tongue. So I'm going to assume that I'm homozygous dominant. Okay, that's just for this activity how I want this to work. Free earlobes, so my earlobes are not free. My earlobes kind of attach to my neck, which means that phenotype is absent. And again, because it is absent and having free earlobes is dominant, I must be homozygous recessive. And then widow's peak, I do have a widow's peak. I do have that little triangle at my hairline, but my mum doesn't. My dad does, my mum doesn't, which means she must have given me a recessive allele. So she must have given me the small w. My dad gave me that. So I put heterozygous for that. Okay, so just go in and add an X. You don't need to put your name or anything like that. Add an X or 2 X's in each of those columns based on your results. Okay, just a little term that we don't go into in huge detail, but it is in the study design that you need to know it. A genome is a fancy term for the complete set of genetic information either in an organism or a population. Okay, what that means is if I took a sample of my blood and sent it off to a lab, they can map all of my DNA. Okay, so they would look at all of the DNA in a haploid set of my chromosomes. Okay, so they're going to look at all of the DNA I have in my chromosomes. That is my genome. This can also be done on a population. So, and you're going to look at a video that talks about an example of this in a minute, but a population would be, let's say we got a blood sample from every student at Mill Park Secondary College. Don't worry, we're not going to do this. But let's say we got a blood sample from every student and then mapped all of the DNA of all of the students combined together. Okay, so that, for example, you know, my DNA would have the gene for blue eyes, because that is the color of my eyes. The genome of Mill Park Secondary College would be much bigger because it would include people that have brown eyes, people that have hazel eyes, people that have very, very, very dark eyes. All of those genes would be included. Okay, so if we are looking generally at a sexually reproducing population, there should be a lot of variation within a genome. Again, in the video, it goes through some interesting statistics, but of the things that can be different, so your height, your weight, the color of your skin, the color of your hair, your shape, all of those kind of things, there is a lot of variation, okay? Some populations or some species don't have a lot of variation, okay? So some species, there might be 1 million individuals in a population, but they might all be very, very similar, in which case their genome isn't going to be that big, particularly if we looked at asexually reproducing organisms. So bacteria, for example, apart from mutation, where there might be a little bit of change, all bacteria in a population should be exactly the same. So their population genome is probably going to be the same as an individual's genome. This is studied in a field called genomics. Okay, so genomics is basically the study of genomes, and it's a really important field of study. It can be used, obviously, to look at the variations within a species. So, for example, within humans, what is all of the different genetic variation that we have? We can use that then to compare how closely related two species are. So, for example, we know that humans are about 98% genetically the same as chimpanzees. Okay, and we only know that through genomics. But the really exciting kind of thing that we can do with this information is look at things like genetic diseases, how prevalent they are, where they come from, and then obviously can work towards treating a lot of those kinds of things. Okay, I want you to go in to the quiz and answer question 4. And then I've also posted a link to a video. It's quite short, less than 4 minutes. I want you to watch that video. There's a few questions in the quiz. There's 3 questions in the quiz, so maybe have a look at those first so you know what you're looking out for. And I want you to have a go at answering those questions, which talks about genomes, but particularly about this thing called the Human Genome Project. Okay, last thing I want you to do. Firstly, question 8. Do you think dominant or recessive alleles are more prevalent in a population? And explain your answer. Once you've done that, and I don't want you to go back and change your answer to question 8, okay? If your answer changes, I want to see that change. So, question 9, I want you to go back to the Google Doc. Hopefully by now everyone's had a bit of time to put their responses in there. If you go in and there's only 5 people's responses, that's fine. Just do it with that information. But hopefully everyone has gone in and been able to add into that. I want you to look at the class data for our 4 different phenotypes. And then if you can, I want you to really simply graph that data. If you're running out of time, don't worry too much about graphing it, but a really simple bar graph. You can do it on your computer or you can do it on a piece of paper. But let's say, for the widow's peak, I don't want you to graph the different genotypes, just the phenotype. So let's say, 12 people said yes, they have a widow's peak, and 6, no, they don't. Okay, that's all I want you to do for each of the 4 different traits, just to have a look at those. And then I want you to consider, are those traits dominant or are they recessive? And then have a think about your answer to question 8. Again, has it changed, your response to that? Maybe it hasn't, that's absolutely fine. But I just want you to basically analyze those results a little bit and then discuss, if your answer changed, why that might be. And that is it for today. Thank you.